Picture this. Summer of 1540. The second figure of authority in England after the king himself is chained and carried to the scaffold in a foggy London. The man is Thomas Cromwell, born the son of a blacksmith, climbed from the humblest of origins to become Earl of Essex and the all-powerful minister at the heart of Henry VIII's court. He saw the foundations of his power crumble within the span of a few days. He was about to learn the lethal truth that closeness to absolute authority could be far more perilous than distance. His fall serves as one of history's starkest reminders that in the volatile Tudor world, the advisor most essential today might be branded a traitor tomorrow. The same man who had orchestrated the downfall of Cardinal Wolsey, engineered Henry's separation from Rome, and sent countless rivals to their deaths would soon be crushed beneath the identical judicial apparatus he had himself honed into a merciless weapon. What renders Cromwell's destruction so chilling is not simply the abruptness with which it arrived, but the deliberate cruelty with which it was carried out, directed by the very monarch whom he had served with unwavering loyalty. Cromwell's ascent to prominence began from the least promising circumstances imaginable. Born around 1485 in the small riverside settlement of Putney, he was the son of a blacksmith and alehouse keeper. His early years were rough, and a violent confrontation with his father drove the young Thomas to flee abroad. He sought fortune on the continent, throwing himself first into mercenary soldiering, and then into the world of European trade. These formative years proved decisive. In Italy he absorbed the unforgiving political philosophy of Machiavelli, as well as the complex banking and financial systems that underpinned Renaissance commerce. Such experiences gave him a sophistication rare among his English peers, one that would later prove invaluable when he maneuvered through the treacherous corridors of power in London. By the time Cromwell returned to England, he had acquired not only considerable wealth but also international connections that gave him a cosmopolitan edge. In the 1520s he entered the household of Cardinal Thomas Wolsey, the king's great minister, and the most powerful man in the realm after Henry himself. Cromwell's brilliance in law, both canon and civil, made him indispensable to Wolsey, especially during the complex negotiations over Henry's attempt to annul his marriage to Catherine of Aragon. When Wolsey's star fell in 1529, dragged down by his failure to secure the annulment, Cromwell managed a rare feat. He stepped aside just enough to avoid sharing in his master's disgrace, while at the same time presenting himself as uniquely useful to the king. By 1532, Cromwell had secured the position of Henry's principal secretary, and from this foothold his authority expanded at a staggering pace. More than any other man, he was the architect of the English Reformation. His motives, however, were less religious than political. For Cromwell, the break with Rome provided not just a solution to Henry's marital difficulties, but also a windfall of wealth and power. By transferring ecclesiastical authority to the king and dissolving ancient religious institutions, Cromwell could strengthen the monarchy's finances and reward loyal supporters. He showed little sentimentality, as he dismantled centuries of tradition. Efficiency and ruthlessness defined his style. He created a network of spies and informers across the kingdom, what historian Hilary Mantel would later call the first truly modern intelligence service. To Cromwell, information equaled power, and he wielded it with devastating precision. Opponents of the king's supremacy in matters of religion often found themselves accused of treason, with evidence carefully prepared by Cromwell's agents. Nothing demonstrated his methods more clearly than the dissolution of the monasteries, which he directed between 1536 and 1541. Hundreds of monasteries that had stood for centuries were closed, their lands were seized, their treasures confiscated, and their residents expelled with meagre compensation. The proceeds filled the royal treasury and enriched Henry's allies, but the social fabric of England was permanently altered. With military-like organization, Cromwell stripped away an institution that had shaped daily life for generations, proving both his administrative genius and his utter pragmatism. By 1540, Cromwell appeared to stand unassailable at the pinnacle of success. He had survived the immense challenge of the Pilgrimage of Grace rebellion, navigated the deadly intrigues surrounding Henry's multiple marriages, and amassed wealth and lands to rival the ancient nobility. His elevation to the title Earl of Essex seemed the crowning moment of a career built on bold calculation and relentless service. Yet that very triumph bred danger. His dominance depended entirely on royal favor, and royal favor was the most volatile currency in Tudor England. Among the displaced nobility, resentment simmered. They looked upon this common-born upstart who had risen above them, and plotted silently for the day when fortune turned. They knew Henry's mood was as unpredictable as the wind and positioned themselves to profit from Cromwell's eventual ruin. His very ruthlessness, which had allowed him to destroy rivals, ensured that when his time came he could expect no pity. The same statutes, courts and charges he had wielded so effectively would be deployed against him by men who had studied his methods closely. By making himself indispensable, he had also made himself isolated. The beginning of his undoing can be traced to a single grave misjudgment. In his eagerness to consolidate England's position in Europe and secure Henry's fourth marriage, Cromwell arranged an alliance with the Protestant German princes through the betrothal of the king to Anne of Cleves. Politically, the match was astute. It strengthened England's Protestant ties at a time when Catholic powers threatened. Personally, however, it was disastrous. The marriage was contracted at the end of 1539, but when Henry first met Anne in January 1540, the king was appalled. Having expected a radiant bride after seeing Hans Holbein's flattering portrait, Henry encountered instead a woman he found plain and unappealing. His cruel quip that she looked like a Flanders mare expressed not only his disappointment, but also a growing resentment of the minister who had negotiated the arrangement. This was no mere matter of personal distaste. The marriage carried wide diplomatic implications. It represented a firm commitment to the Protestant-German alliance precisely at a moment when Henry's calculations were shifting. Charles V, the Holy Roman Emperor, hinted at more advantageous ties with Catholic Europe, options that required abandoning the Protestant pact that Cromwell had labored to construct. Cromwell now found himself trapped, bound by loyalty to the alliance, yet forced to placate a furious monarch desperate to rid himself of an unwanted wife. The thoroughness with which he had drafted the original marriage contract now worked against him. The very strength of his negotiations made it exceedingly difficult to find legal grounds for annulment. What had been his triumph became his noose. Henry's dissatisfaction with Anne soon entangled itself with broader disputes over religion. Conservative nobles, spearheaded by the Duke of Norfolk, pressed for reconciliation with Catholic Europe and sought to reverse Cromwell's radical Protestant reforms. To their advantage came the king's sudden attraction to Norfolk's young niece Catherine Howard. Henry's infatuation provided the conservatives with the perfect weapon. The prospect of a fifth marriage promised the king personal gratification and political flexibility, but it required dismantling the structures Cromwell had built. The once indispensable minister began to look less like the king's savior and more like the principal obstacle to his happiness. Cromwell's response to this mounting crisis revealed both his remarkable political skill and the vulnerability that came with standing alone. He tried to orchestrate Anne of Cleves' consent to an annulment while preserving his influence over the kingdom's religious course. But his enemies had learned from his own example. They began preparing their case against him with the same techniques he had perfected: whispered accusations, careful gathering of evidence, manipulation of religious suspicion. The rapidity with which his position unraveled displayed the lethal fragility of power in Henry's court. Within mere months of being raised to the dignity of an earl, Cromwell was suddenly confronted with charges of heresy and treason, pressed by men who until recently had bowed before his authority. The governmental machinery he himself had refined now worked seamlessly against him. The instruments of surveillance, prosecution and propaganda that had once made him untouchable were now wielded with equal precision by those who sought his destruction. The paradox of his career could not have been clearer. The same brilliance that had elevated him to unprecedented heights was now orchestrating his fall. The conspiracy that would bring Thomas Cromwell down was assembled with a cold and methodical precision worthy of the man himself. At the centre stood Thomas Howard, Duke of Norfolk, champion of the Catholic faction at court. Norfolk knew that Cromwell's ruin could not rely solely on the king's displeasure over the Cleves marriage. Henry's moods were volatile, and irritation could fade. What was needed was a case so compelling, so thoroughly supported by charges of heresy and treason, that the king's passing resentment would be transformed into righteous fury. Norfolk and his allies played upon Henry's deepest fears. For years the king had defined himself as the defender of true faith, navigating a path between papal supremacy on one side and Protestant radicalism on the other. By portraying Cromwell as a dangerous heretic, secretly advancing radical Protestant doctrines while deceiving the king, Norfolk struck at the very heart of Henry's self-image. To attack Cromwell on religious grounds was to suggest that the king himself had been manipulated into straying from orthodoxy. Letters once considered routine diplomatic correspondence were suddenly reinterpreted as proof of treasonous conspiracy. Cromwell's exchanges with reformers on the continent, which had previously been valued for intelligence gathering, were now twisted into evidence of disloyalty. His network of Protestant contacts across Germany, Switzerland and the Low Countries, once assets, were paraded as incriminating ties to heretical extremists. The scaffolding of Cromwell's European diplomacy was rebranded as the framework of betrayal, Among Norfolk's allies stood Stephen Gardiner, Bishop of Winchester, an able theologian who had long resented Cromwell's dominance in religious affairs. Gardiner lent intellectual weight to the accusations. With scholarly authority, he argued that Cromwell had permitted heretical teachings to spread under the guise of reform, subtly undermining the king's role as supreme head of the church. The accusations were carefully tailored to appeal to Henry's anxieties, his desire to be seen as orthodox, his loathing of radicalism, and his suspicion of anyone whose loyalty seemed divided. Timing was everything. Norfolk understood that the king's growing infatuation with his young niece Catherine Howard provided the perfect backdrop. Catherine's youth, beauty and vivacity contrasted sharply with the plain and unwanted Anne of Cleves, reinforcing the impression that Cromwell had deceived Henry in arranging the German marriage. As the king's passion for Catherine deepened, so too did his willingness to listen to Norfolk's whispers. Catherine was presented not merely as a bride, but as the symbol of a new political course, one free from Cromwell's Protestant entanglements. By the spring of 1540, the atmosphere at court had changed dramatically. The minister who had once been courted and feared found himself increasingly isolated. Observers noted how courtiers, who only months earlier had jostled for his favor, now kept their distance. Whispers in corridors, sidelong glances in the council chamber, and sudden silences when he entered a room all signaled that the tide had turned. These men had learned to read the weather of royal favor, and the signs all pointed to storm. Cromwell, blinded by his confidence in his indispensability, failed to grasp the scale of the conspiracy gathering against him. He still believed his administrative genius, and the king's reliance on his abilities would shield him, even as his enemies tightened the net. His focus remained fixed on extricating Henry from the Cleves marriage, not realizing that this very task was being used as the pretext for his destruction. On June 10, 1540, the trap was finally sprung. The council meeting at Westminster began like any other. As Lord Privy Seal, and newly created Earl of Essex, Cromwell presided over discussions of routine government business. Nothing in his demeanor betrayed the catastrophe that was about to unfold. Some later accounts claim there was an unusual tension in the chamber, but if Cromwell sensed it, he gave no outward sign. In the midst of proceedings, the Duke of Norfolk suddenly rose. In his hands he carried a document, formal charges of treason and heresy against Cromwell. With cold authority, he began to read. The list was sweeping: that Cromwell had promoted heretical doctrines, maintained treasonous correspondence with foreign powers, and deliberately misled the king in matters of profound importance to the realm. Stunned silence fell. Cromwell himself seemed momentarily incapable of speech. Here was the man who had orchestrated the downfall of so many others through similar procedures, suddenly caught in the machinery he had once commanded. When he tried to protest, his words were drowned out by Norfolk's command that he be placed under arrest. Guards moved swiftly, seizing him before he could mount any defense. The symbolism of what followed was deliberate and cruel. Before the eyes of his fellow councillors, Cromwell was stripped of the insignia of the Order of the Garter, an honour granted only weeks earlier as England's highest mark of esteem. His staff of office was broken, his sword removed, and he was reduced from peer of the realm to prisoner in a matter of moments. Contemporary witnesses recorded the oppressive atmosphere of that council chamber. Men who had served under Cromwell for years sat rigid and silent, afraid that any gesture of sympathy might be read as complicity. The transformation of the most powerful minister in England into a captive unfolded in minutes, shocking even those who despised him. The humiliation was not complete until chains were brought forward. In Tudor political culture, chains were more than restraints. They were the visible symbols of disgrace, traditionally reserved for common criminals. To see the Earl of Essex bound like a thief ensured that his fall was unmistakable and irreversible. Norfolk had orchestrated every moment to maximize Cromwell's degradation. News of the arrest spread through London with astonishing speed. The people of the city, who had long viewed Cromwell with a mixture of admiration and resentment, crowded into the streets to witness his downfall. Only days before he had been the architect of royal policy. Now he was paraded as a captive. The transformation was so sudden that it sent ripples of fear through the court and populace alike, a vivid reminder of how precarious fortune could be under Henry VIII. Those who saw him led away remarked on his altered appearance. The once commanding figure seemed diminished, bewildered, and prematurely aged. The assured administrator had given way to a shaken man who could scarcely comprehend the magnitude of his reversal. The carefully crafted persona of power and control was shattered in a single day. His destination was the Tower of London, the fortress that had witnessed the ruin of so many of his own victims. Now it became his own prison. The symbolism was brutal. Cromwell would endure the same fate he had imposed on others, surrounded by the ghosts of men and women who had passed through those gates on their way to execution. From the first, his confinement was harsh. The luxuries of power were stripped away, gone were the silks, the feasts and the grand chambers that had marked his high station. In their place he found a cramped cold cell with little light and less comfort. His garments were rough, his meals plain and inadequate. This deliberate contrast underscored the completeness of his fall from grace. Interrogation began almost immediately. Ironically, his captors used techniques he himself had perfected as Henry's minister. Physical torture was rarely necessary. Cromwell had taught them the greater value of psychological pressure. They confronted him with his own correspondence, reinterpreting letters written for diplomatic purposes as treasonous plots. Every phrase was twisted against him, every contact transformed into evidence of disloyalty. Even crueler were the visits arranged by former allies who now turned their backs. These meetings served a dual purpose. They reinforced Cromwell's isolation and tested his mental state. Each cold conversation reminded him of his abandonment. Colleagues who had once sought his patronage now regarded him as a stranger, a warning to others of the consequences of loyalty to a fallen man. The combination of deprivation, stress and despair quickly eroded his health. Observers noted his once solid frame became gaunt, his complexion pale, his eyes hollow with fatigue. The interrogations alternated between aggression and false sympathy, designed to confuse and break him. The psychological toll was immense. Perhaps most devastating of all was the silence from Henry himself. No messenger arrived with reassurance, no word of clemency softened his despair. The king whom Cromwell had served so faithfully appeared to have abandoned him completely. In Tudor politics, such silence was more eloquent than any condemnation. It signaled that the monarch had already passed judgment. In the end, Cromwell's own methods became the instruments of his torment. The intelligence networks he had once directed supplied the evidence used against him. The propaganda tools he had wielded now shaped public perception of his guilt. The legislative machinery he had bent to the king's will was readied to destroy him. He had constructed the system that could obliterate a man without trial, and now he was trapped within it. Once confined within the Tower, Cromwell's fate was sealed not by a formal trial, but by a political instrument he himself had often employed against others, the Bill of Attainder. His enemies understood that an open trial might allow him to mount a defense, or worse, to expose the weaknesses of their case. They opted instead for the most ruthless yet efficient mechanism available. A Bill of Attainder could pronounce guilt by parliamentary decree, sparing the inconvenience of evidence or testimony. The charges laid against Cromwell were sweeping and deliberately imprecise. He was accused of treasons, murders, robberies, and other heinous crimes, though specifics were scarce. Vagueness served its purpose. There would be little to debate or disprove. The most damaging accusations centered on religion. Cromwell was said to have promoted heretical teachings, shielded known heretics, and weakened the king's authority over the English church. For Henry, who prided himself on being a defender of orthodoxy, such claims struck deep. The treason allegations were sharpened by focusing on foreign correspondence. Letters to German reformers and Protestant allies, once useful for diplomacy, were reinterpreted as evidence of dangerous collusion. The disastrous marriage to Anne of Cleves was reframed as an act of calculated betrayal. Cromwell, they insisted, had knowingly ensnared the king in a union harmful both politically and personally. What had once been an error of judgment was twisted into proof of treachery. The bill moved rapidly through both houses of Parliament. Cromwell's allies, cowed by his arrest, remained silent. Those few who dared speak in his defense were quickly silenced by reminders of royal displeasure. Everyone understood that opposing the bill would be seen as defiance of the king himself. Thus the legislative body, that Cromwell had once manipulated so effectively, became the very instrument of his annihilation. The provisions of the attainder were absolute. Cromwell was condemned to death. His estates, titles and possessions were confiscated. His family was left dishonored, barred from reclaiming lands or status. This was not merely the elimination of a man, but the erasure of a dynasty. For Cromwell, who had fought to elevate his family from obscurity, this was an especially cruel blow. When he learned of the attainder, the irony could not have been sharper. The very machinery he had constructed to consolidate Henry's supremacy had been turned against him. The legislative sleight of hand that once served his ambitions now stripped him of dignity, wealth and life without a single day in court. Yet even condemned, Cromwell's usefulness was not exhausted. His enemies extracted every possible advantage from his desperation. Chief among their demands was his assistance in securing the annulment of Henry's marriage to Anne of Cleves. The match that had damned him now became the instrument of his final service. Even as he languished in chains, Cromwell was compelled to unravel his own diplomatic work. Despite the certainty of his fate, he complied. Some hoped, perhaps still flickered within him, that extraordinary service might soften the king's heart. Others suggest he simply clung to any task to delay the inevitable. His deep knowledge of the original negotiations made him uniquely suited to find legal grounds for dissolution, and his continental contacts were still valuable in persuading Anne's family to accept the annulment. Thus, in one last cruel twist, he was forced to dismantle what he had so painstakingly built. Descriptions from those who visited him during this time portray a man physically and emotionally broken. His once dark hair turned white in weeks, his face lined with despair, his body frail. Gone was the imposing statesman who had commanded nobles and bishops alike. In his place stood a prisoner, diminished and humbled, pleading for mercy he knew would not come. Religion, ironically the central accusation against him, occupied his final thoughts. The man denounced as a heretic sought spiritual counsel from Protestant ministers, attempting to reconcile earthly failure with the hope of divine pardon. These consultations provided him solace, but also served the narrative of his foes, reinforcing the claim that he leaned toward dangerous doctrine. His letters from the Tower reveal a poignant mixture of resignation and defiance. To his son Gregory, he wrote words of guidance, pleas to remain steadfast, to preserve honor, to carry the family name with dignity, despite the disgrace of his father's fall. These communications, carefully monitored by his captors, show a man still clinging to his role as father and counselor, even as his own future evaporated. Meanwhile, the question of his execution was debated at court. By law, a traitor could be hanged, drawn, and quartered, a death of utmost brutality. Yet as a peer of the realm, Cromwell might be granted the mercy of beheading. This decision was not merely about punishment, but about symbolism. To treat him as a noble, acknowledged however grudgingly, his status, to treat him as a common criminal, would emphasize his disgrace. Ultimately, Henry chose decapitation. Whether this reflected lingering gratitude for Cromwell's years of service or simple expedience remains unclear. But for Cromwell, it was the slenderest of mercies. Throughout these weeks, he nourished a desperate hope that the king might relent. Rumors were allowed to reach him, suggesting clemency was still possible. His enemies encouraged this belief, for a man clinging to life was more compliant than one resigned to death. Only at the last moment did reality crash down in full. There would be no reprieve. The psychological torment was profound. Few punishments could have equaled the cruelty of keeping him suspended between hope and despair, forced to work diligently in the vain belief that his efforts might save him. Day after day, he was reminded that his fate rested entirely on the whim of the monarch he had served so completely. Visitors to his cell reported his exhaustion and despair, but also occasional flashes of dignity. He was said to speak with calmness at times, reflecting on the vanity of earthly success, on the fickleness of fortune, on the certainty of God's judgment. In these moments, Cromwell seemed almost philosophical, aware that he was living out the cautionary tale he himself had so often told others. In Henry's England, power was fleeting, and no man, however indispensable, was safe. The final preparations for his execution were carefully orchestrated. The date was chosen deliberately, July 28, 1540. The same day Henry VIII would marry Catherine Howard. The juxtaposition was not accidental. By coupling Cromwell's destruction with the celebration of a new royal union, Henry ensured that the shadow of execution would be eclipsed by festivity. For the king, it was a demonstration of absolute control. He could destroy his most trusted servant and take a new bride in the same breath. For Cromwell, the symbolism was bitter beyond words. The match with Cleves had raised him to the height of power and dragged him to ruin. The match with Howard would be sealed with his death. In both cases, Henry's marital choices determined his minister's fate. The night before his execution, Cromwell is said to have prayed fervently, preparing himself for the end. He had lost everything, wealth, power, honor, but he clung to the hope of divine mercy. He had been condemned by men, but perhaps God would judge him differently. On the morning of July 28, 1540, Thomas Cromwell was led from his cell in the Tower of London to the scaffold on Tower Hill. The date had been chosen with deliberate calculation. It coincided with Henry VIII's wedding to Catherine Howard, ensuring that the king's new joy would overshadow the grim necessity of destroying his former servant. The juxtaposition was cruel theatre, the celebration of youth and beauty on one side, the public ruin of the minister blamed for the Cleves disaster on the other. The journey from prison to execution site was intended as humiliation. Once Cromwell had travelled through London in triumph, attended by retinues, his authority unquestioned. Now he shuffled in irons, jeered at by crowds eager to glimpse his downfall. The stark contrast between his past magnificence and present degradation served as a living lesson in the volatility of fortune under a monarch like Henry. Tower Hill was the traditional place of execution for high-ranking traitors. An elevated wooden platform had been constructed so that a large crowd could witness the spectacle. Executions in Tudor England were not merely punishments but public demonstrations of royal authority. They were political theatre, designed to terrify and to remind subjects of the king's absolute power. Cromwell's final moments, therefore, were carefully staged for maximum effect. Contemporary observers left varying accounts of his demeanour. Some claimed he maintained composure befitting a nobleman, speaking calmly despite his circumstances. Others noted a tremor in his voice, as though the weight of despair broke through even his practiced self-control. His final speech was measured and cautious. He avoided declarations of innocence that might be construed as a challenge to the king's justice. Instead, he confessed to being a sinner like all men, prayed for the king, and appealed for God's mercy. It was the speech of a man determined to preserve some shred of dignity, even as he faced obliteration. Henry had granted him the relative mercy of beheading, rather than the gruesome death of hanging, drawing and quartering customary for traitors. Whether this concession sprang from lingering gratitude, or from sheer practicality, it spared Cromwell a fate of prolonged agony. Yet the symbolism remained unmistakable. The king had raised a commoner to the heights of power, and cast him down with equal swiftness. The executioner's axe ended his life in a single stroke. In that instant, the most powerful minister England had ever known became just another severed head, another warning mounted for the public to see. His body was interred without ceremony, in an unmarked grave, denied the honours his rank once demanded. His head was set upon London Bridge beside those of other traitors, a grisly display of royal authority over life and memory. News of Cromwell's death raced across the kingdom and beyond. In England, reactions were mixed. Some among the populace rejoiced, convinced that the architect of religious upheaval had received divine punishment. Others viewed his end with unease, realizing that if a man so central to the king's government could be destroyed in days, no one was safe. Among courtiers, his ruin was a warning. Proximity to Henry was as dangerous as it was rewarding. Abroad, diplomats reported with fascination. To foreign courts, the episode revealed the frightening unpredictability of English politics. The carefully constructed Protestant alliance collapsed overnight, as continental princes concluded that Henry's policies were unreliable, bound not by treaties but by whim. Catholic rulers celebrated Cromwell's fall as proof of divine justice, while Protestant allies saw it as evidence of England's instability. The completeness of Cromwell's destruction was remarkable. Only months earlier he had been indispensable. Now his family was disgraced, his property confiscated, his name synonymous with betrayal. The obliteration was not just personal but dynastic, ensuring that his descendants could not easily restore the family's fortunes. Historians have wrestled with his legacy ever since. Contemporary Catholic chroniclers painted him as an arrogant upstart, punished by God for tearing down centuries of tradition. They highlighted his humble birth, his presumption in rising above his station, and his supposed heresies. In their accounts, his downfall was the inevitable consequence of divine justice. Protestant writers, by contrast, cast him as a martyr to reform, a man of vision destroyed by conservative enemies. They stressed his administrative skill, his role in liberating England from papal control, and depicted his execution as a judicial murder orchestrated by jealous nobles. Diplomatic sources offered a third perspective, focusing less on religion and more on international politics. For them, the real significance lay in the collapse of England's Protestant diplomacy and the demonstration that Henry could annihilate even his most trusted servant. Cromwell's fate became evidence of England's unreliability as an ally. Modern historians present a more complex picture. Cromwell was no saint, nor merely a villain. He was a pragmatic administrator, whose policies were guided by political calculation rather than dogma. His use of parliament, propaganda, and intelligence networks anticipated modern statecraft. He understood that government could be made into an instrument of control more efficient than armies. Yet his methods carried their own doom. By creating a system capable of crushing opponents swiftly and mercilessly, he ensured that when his own time came, it would crush him with equal efficiency. The machine he built devoured its master. Henry's regret came quickly. Within months of the execution, The king admitted he had been ill-served by those who pushed Cromwell's condemnation. It was a rare acknowledgement, though too late to save the man who had served him most effectively. Without Cromwell, governance faltered. Religious policy veered erratically with the king's moods. Diplomacy collapsed, leaving England isolated. Financial administration suffered. The nobles who had conspired against Cromwell proved incapable of replacing his competence. Cromwell's legacy, therefore, is paradoxical. In his lifetime, he was reviled as a tyrant, feared as the king's hammer, and finally destroyed as a traitor. Yet modern scholarship recognizes him as one of the great innovators of English governance. His intelligence networks, bureaucratic reforms and manipulation of law laid foundations that would endure long after his disgrace. His story resonates because it embodies universal themes: ambition, rise, betrayal, and the fragility of power. He rose from humble beginnings to heights unimaginable, only to fall with terrifying speed. His own skills, which had lifted him above nobles and bishops, became the instruments of his downfall. In the end, Cromwell's final days on Tower Hill stand as a meditation on the perils of serving absolute monarchy. The king's favour was both lifeline and death sentence. Cromwell had ridden it higher than any commoner before him, and when it shifted, he fell further than most could imagine. The scaffold on Tower Hill remains a symbol of his fate, the place where the architect of the English Reformation, the minister who reshaped law and religion, discovered that no man, however brilliant or indispensable, could survive the caprice of a king.